the person driving a Mercedes. And so that's a place where being aware that, yeah, okay, there's bias around that can help make sure that we aren't treating people differently. And I know you were mentioning that during lunch, that's something that you've experienced, right? I'm sorry, I don't know your name in the back. Bill, okay. Yeah. So, I also gave the example of a different type of bias, and I'm not proud of this, but when I was at the Lucia Pantry, somebody showed up and they started speaking to me in Spanish. And I speak some Spanish because my mom is Mexican, but I couldn't understand at the pace that they were speaking. I said, oh, here's where you get your number to get in line for the pantry, and then this is where you'll sit. They were there to volunteer. I made an assumption based on their language, but that bias partially stemmed from my mom was a migrant farm worker and accessed food programs, and I think I made a personal connection to my mom and her story, but I still made an assumption about why this person was there based on the language they were speaking and how they looked. And so, 8 years later, 10 years later, I had to really think through, where did that come from? And so I think those are the times where just being aware that bias exists can help inform how we act. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to go over the non-discrimination section, and this is also part of the community agreement. But again, if you were part of a TFAB-funded program, they do this every year, so I do always think it's a good refresher, also as we're supporting volunteers that we're bringing into this work. So the goals of this are to ensure equal treatment for all guests, have knowledge of the volunteers' responsibilities around making sure that we're not discriminating, eliminate barriers that prevent or deter people from receiving food, and provide dignity and respect to everybody. Okay, so I think most people know what discrimination is, but again, doesn't hurt to go over the definition. The intentional or negligent act of treating an individual or groups of individuals different than others are treated because of the individual or group's actual perceived membership in a protected class. So then we'll go, if you click the next one. These are the protected classes as defined by the federal government. Certainly not the only way or the only groups that can be discriminated against, but I think it's helpful to see, what are some of the ways in which people might experience discrimination? Race, color, national origin, and this includes limited English proficiency, disability, age, gender, and religion. And I think of these, the one that I've heard people maybe encounter the most are folks that are limited English proficiency, that there's sometimes language barriers. So we'll eventually talk about a tool in your packet there that might be a good resource. Okay, so I think it's really helpful to remember the 3 Ds of discrimination, especially for new volunteers coming in. And those are denial of benefits or services. And one of the nice things is that Second Harvest does not require you to fill out any eligibility paperwork. So it is less likely that we will be experiencing a situation where we would deny somebody. However, as Laura mentioned earlier this morning, there will be a proxy setup coming out. I think that's being developed, right? Being conscious of there may be a time where somebody says, I'm picking up for myself and somebody else, or I'm picking up and the person in the passenger seat is picking up for another family. And it might not be you all, but it might be one of the volunteers on site says, I don't trust this person. I'm not going to do that. Well, as also was mentioned this morning, we should err on the side of trusting people and getting them food. And if they were in fact picking up for somebody else, and even if they weren't, we would still want to give them food. But if they were, that could be considered denial of benefits or services and explicit discrimination. Delay of services, I think this is the one that comes up the most. Somebody has there's a language barrier, and so we say, can you wait over here for a minute so we can figure this out, and I don't want to hold up the line. Or somebody has car issues, this came up in the last session, their trunk won't open, can you pull over there? I need to make sure that the line keeps moving. That delay of services can be discrimination unless we make reasonable accommodations. And so in the last session, the reasonable accommodation for the trunk that gets stuck is, they bring up the cart. How many of you do the drive up right now? Okay. So they bring the cart up and then the trunk is stuck, so they have them go over to the side, but then the cart follows them, right? It's like, I'll have you kind of get that in your vehicle so I can keep going, but their food still follows them. So that's an example of a reasonable accommodation in that situation. And then disadvantage due to different treatment. Do any of you have choice setups right now where people go through? Okay, so an example of disadvantage due to different treatment could be somebody has been delayed services because either I couldn't understand what they were saying, or we haven't, for whatever reason, they're pulled to the side to kind of wait. And as a result, some of those choices of the better foods, the better meats, the highly requested items get selected first. That's then two instances or two types of discrimination. Yes.
One of the things we ran into, especially during COVID, where the trunks wouldn't open,
Yeah.
they wanted us to put them in inside of their car.
Okay.
And we were told not to do that. So we'd have to move them aside, build up a cart for them, put it over there so they could have to load it themselves.
Huh.
And a lot of them didn't like to do that.
Right. I wonder, I don't know that setup as much, what the reason for
COVID, possibly.
Okay.
Yeah, it was
a COVID safety thing.
It was COVID. We were not allowed to go. They had to keep their windows up and everything.
Yeah, that is really complicated because also wanting to accommodate any physical disabilities, right? That COVID has made things so ambiguous in a lot of ways, and I wish there was clear answers to some of these, but that's hard,
It was a very hard situation at times.
Yeah.
The way we dealt with that is during the very beginning of COVID is we would put 3 piles of food off to the side, and if it wasn't a trunk, they could pull right up and take one of those piles of food.
Yeah, that's what we were.
So there wasn't a delay. There wasn't a delay for them.
Yeah, and again, this language is adapted from the federal government's language, which is the most extreme, right? We want to make sure people are not discriminating. It sounds like in all these examples, there's reasonable accommodations. I still like their language because, of course, we don't want to discriminate against people. We want to make sure that the folks that show up to volunteer, that support the coordinators on site, also don't discriminate against people. And part of that is being explicit and clear about those expectations. But making reasonable accommodations is the best way that we can sort of address these things. Okay. Any other questions or clarifying comments? No? Okay. All right, so discrimination occurs when we fail to provide reasonable accommodations, provide food and courtesy to all people at a time, place, or in a manner that treats them equally, provide equal information, eligibility criteria, and access to all pantry guests, and provide support for people who have limited English proficiency. So bullet 3 here, provide equal information, eligibility criteria, and access to all pantry guests. I have seen that come up with folks that are undocumented, where because there are a lot of pantries that do require some sort of documentation, that can be a deterrent from participation. So if we ask things in a particular way or are unclear in who can or cannot attend and somebody is undocumented, it can appear as if we're discriminating. And again, I'm just going to leave it there. So, okay. Thank you. So preventing discrimination, reasonable accommodations, we can do that through reasonable accommodations for people who have disabilities, reasonable accommodations for people with limited English proficiency, training for people supporting pantry guests. And so, we mentioned bias. Microaggressions is a whole other topic that Laura and I have talked about. Is that something we want to offer at a different point? We're not going to do it today. Having solid customer service. So some of those things that were in the agreement, like letting people know about wait times, letting them know, hey, I'm going to have you pull over here, but I'm going to support you in this way. All those things that are just good customer service can contribute to preventing discrimination or the perception of discrimination. And then conflict resolution methods and skills. And again, I think that would actually be a training that's helpful in the future, because there can be times where somebody shows up to receive food and they might be in a stressful situation and, you're having a great day and they're not having a great day, and that creates tension and somebody ends up walking away because of a conflict. Of course, yes.
I'll give you a quick example if I may.
Yes.
We used to do numbers because we used to be outside in the clients would line up, and we would give them a number in line. And I was passing out the numbers, and this young lady got the number, and she took the number and threw it on the ground and just started calling me every name under the book and every F word that could be used. And having taught high school for 35 years, I was able to deal with that simply because we
Yes.
had high school students who would do similar things.
Yep.
And I just said, you need to just calm down for a minute. And she went over by a bunch of her friends, and a university student that was observing our pantry came over and he said, I was so worried I thought I was going to have to call the police because I thought she was going to punch you out. Long story short, she's coming out and she comes up and gives me a hug and said, I got food. And she said, I'm so sorry that I went off on you and I swore at you, but when I saw the number 99, I thought there was no way in hell I was going to get food. And I was so worried because she said, I haven't had a thing to eat for 7 days.
Yeah.
And it just shows you.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, that actually takes skill, right? It's like something that